Hi, I'm Festival Pyro. Now, chances are that if you're a beginner like me, you've heard this at least once before. You should work on your anatomy. But let's be honest, that's easier said than done because what does it even mean? That's where this video comes in. I'm going to walk you through what a typical week of practicing anatomy looks like for me, so that hopefully by watching what I do, you can get a sense of what to do yourself. Something we should cover first are warm-ups. While some might consider these unnecessary and prefer to just jump straight into their studies or the piece they're currently working on, I do think that they are incredibly beneficial. Not only do they help with loosening your hand, but they're also good for getting you in the right mindset and are a great way of building your skills by incorporating additional exercises that you might not otherwise have time for. There are tons of different warm-ups out there, from lines, circles, shapes, volumes, all of which you can customize to suit your individual needs. I tend to do them every day that I'm drawing, and in case you're curious about which ones I do to practice anatomy, I'll have a video that goes over that linked down below. Warm-ups usually take me about 10 to 15 minutes and they've become one of the most calming parts of my routine. There's something about the repetitive ones that scratches the right itch in my autistic brain, and once I've done them, I feel a lot more focused and ready to move on to what is typically the hardest part of my study sessions. I treat gesture drawing as its own category, but it is really just a warm-up, especially if you only do 30-second or 1-minute gestures. They are kind of an essential part to studying the human figure because they help you lay down the framework for structure, whilst also developing your muscle memory when it comes to proportions. By doing hundreds of them, which you'll get to easily if you do them every day, you improve your ability to eyeball proportions and place the different limbs and body parts correctly in space. You start to recognize which poses look natural, which ones don't, and that's something that no amount of detailed anatomy is going to fix. I do have to say that for the longest time I absolutely hated doing gestures, and my feelings towards them haven't really changed much, but they are great when it comes to figure drawing, and I do recognize and accept that if I want to get good at art, I just kinda have to do them. A book that I've been referencing for these past few weeks has been Jeff Mellum's How to Draw People book, which I've talked about in previous videos. It's been a really helpful guide for breaking the figure down into understandable parts, and if you've been looking for a book to start off with, I would definitely recommend this one. Jeff gives studying simplified skeletons as the next step after you've done some work with armatures and gesture drawing. If you're not familiar, armatures are essentially glorified stick figures. Still super simple, but there's just a bit more attention given to the structure and proportions. I have done a few pages of them in the past, and whilst I do think that they are a good starting point for complete beginners, I personally didn't find them all that useful. For this week though, I did want to start moving towards drawing full 3-dimensional figures. Jeff emphasizes that at this stage it's not really about memorizing every individual bone, and instead the goal is to understand how the main volumes of the body interact and move in space. Most of these were copied directly from the book, and whilst that is okay, I would recommend using photo references too. They're a great way of seeing how these simplified forms translate to real human poses. For day 2, I focused on something that's often overlooked, and that is the shoulder girdle. It's made up of 2 main parts, the clavicles in the front and the scapulae in the back, otherwise known as your collarbones and shoulder blades. These bones work together to encircle the top of the ribcage and form the bony base that attaches your arms to your torso. It's a good idea to learn how these bones move together because even though you can't see them when drawing a character, the way they move under the surface does affect how the skin and muscles stretch, compress and twist. For example, when you raise an arm to the side and up, the scapula rotates away from the spine, which makes it look like it's pushing out a bit, and if you don't know that that's something that happens, you might make the underarm area of the torso too slim and your figure will look off. After that, I moved on to the skeleton of the arm and copied Jeff's demonstrations of how to draw it. I do think it's good to recognize the way the bones overlap or stay aligned in different positions because, again, even though you don't see the bones under all the skin and muscles, it does affect the shape of the arm. Day 3 didn't go quite as I would have liked. Maybe it's because we were in the middle of the week, but I just didn't end up doing as much as I wanted to. I started by following Jeff's demonstration of the lower body, but I didn't even do that in full because I skipped over the feet. I had intended to take it further, of course, and I wanted to draw 3 full body skeletons too, but as you can see, I didn't even finish the one. I tried, but I just wasn't as confident in the bones as I should have been, and I also wasn't interested in getting better. Please don't be like me and actually put in the work. If you're struggling with something, take a step back and come back to it again later on, because I'm sure that whatever it is that you're struggling with is going to come in more handy than you think. The 4th day went by much better than the previous one, both in terms of enjoyment and how much I was able to get done. After having spent a good portion of last month focused on head construction, I was able to come into the session with a stronger foundation, and I felt more confident blocking out shapes than I would have otherwise. I was still working through Jeff Mellum's book, and while it doesn't always explain the why behind every exercise, his instructions are visually pretty good, and the general structure of the book does make sense to me. For example, earlier he has you drawing heads using really simple forms, essentially just a sphere with a mask as the face, and that might seem overly simple, but it's a good starting point for recognizing the orientation and angle of the head before adding in complexity. Now that we've progressed through the skeleton and are heading into simplified volumes, we're taking that initial ball and mask shape and refining it, cutting out a wedge for the brow and eye region and carving off the sides to give it more of that human head shape. I started the day by warming up with the merging forms exercise. I talk about it more in my art warm-ups video, but in short, it's great because it gets you thinking about the ways in which 3D volumes can connect with each other, which is exactly what I needed before diving into torsos. For the first torso I drew, I approached it in a similar way to what I did on day 1, starting with a simplified skeleton of the ribcage and hips. But then I added a sort of sack around it that enveloped those parts and was meant to represent the layer of skin that goes over the bones, muscles and fat. After copying a few of Jeff Mellum's torso demonstrations, I felt like I wasn't completely confident in my ability to do this on my own, so I wanted to take some extra time to internalize what I'd been studying. To do that, I made up an exercise sheet using photos I got from a Dorcas stock, and I filled it in. For most of these, I traced the torso directly over the pose and then redrew the shape beside it. On the left, I tried rotating the torso a bit to help me properly visualize it as a 3D shape in space. I also broke some of these down further into simplified skeletons to see how the bones supported the structure. And then for the last two, I didn't trace, I just drew what I saw, and I am pretty happy with how they turned out. This kind of exercise is a great way of testing your understanding. After having spent time copying from a book or studying from photos, you can take a few poses and try drawing them rotated, as well as drawing them broken down into more simple shapes. Practicing circles and cylinders for my warm-up on day 6 was a very good call because those shapes ended up forming the base for most of what I worked on. The leg studies went fairly well. Using cylinders to block out the shapes of the legs and boxes for the pelvis and knees helped me visualize their structure. Overall, I felt relatively comfortable there, but then I moved on to arms and that is where I struggled a lot. For some reason, there's something about the upper arm, specifically the rounded shoulder shape, that I find really awkward and don't like drawing. Maybe it's a perspective issue, but I kind of just think it comes down to a lack of practice. I did fill in most of the second page, but I think what could have done me good would have been to take a step back and then find a way to practice drawing simplified volumes of the arms on my own. Maybe taking some reference photos from Pinterest and drawing over those would have helped me to visualize this better. And now finally, day 7, the last day of this little study week. Let me just start by saying that, yeah, there were plenty of mistakes made in all of these poses, but overall, I had a pretty productive study session and I'm very pleased with how everything turned out. I started by copying 2 poses from the book I'd been using throughout the week, doing my best to recreate the 3D volumes whilst also keeping the flow of the poses. I began with quick armature sketches and then added the larger shapes over that. It was pretty clear to me that I was struggling with some of the placement, so I decided to scale back and try some simpler poses. I found some simplified figure drawings by Melon Soup on Pinterest and decided to copy 4 of them, thinking that maybe studying the way someone else simplifies their shapes could be beneficial. And it was. The first 2 didn't go too well, but with each one I got more and more confident and they did get progressively better and better. What's funny though is that the way Melon simplifies their figures, or at least the way in which I interpret her figures, is a lot more gestural and suits me much better than the way in which Jeff does. I naturally lean towards that rather than like rigid construction, so it did click with me more. To finish, I simplified 3 real-life poses, and whilst they're not as bad as I remember them being now that I'm looking back over them, there are things that I need to continue working on. Spending a week going over the full figure and breaking down each part into individual study sessions can really help pinpoint which areas you're comfortable with and which ones need more attention. For me, arms are definitely on the list. I've spent a good amount of time working on head and feel a lot more confident there, so I think it's time to spend the same amount of energy on the arms now. Something that is good to remember too is that whilst there isn't technically anything wrong with focusing on just one resource, it is a good idea to incorporate other materials into your study plan. Whether it's a book, photos, other artists, there's something to learn from each of those, and it will help you to gain a more well-rounded perspective. Thank you so much for watching. I do hope that this video has helped you gain some insight into how to go about studying anatomy yourself, and I will see you in the next video.